Welcome to the second devotional for today. It is taken from 2 Chronicles chapter 31, and the title, Hezekiah, a model of success. This is the second daily devotional video for this Monday, February the 12th. Well, 2 Chronicles 31, notice with me, if you would, in the first verse, what I would describe as a fervor of revival and sacrificial giving. Now, the spiritual zeal for the Lord did not diminish when the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread were ended. In fact, we read, when the people departed Jerusalem, they began to go throughout the cities of Judah and Israel, breaking down idols and cutting down the groves that had been places of worship contrary to God's law. Now, you'll remember back in 2 Chronicles chapter 30 that as the people approached the Passover, they began to tear down all the idols and the groves that were within the vicinity of Jerusalem. Now, those same people are departing Jerusalem after the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And as they make their way through Judah and Israel, they begin tearing down the places of idol worship. And so we read in verse 1, when all the idol places were destroyed, every man returned to his city and possessions. Now, notice again, if you would, in verses 2 through 4, the establishment of regular worship. Again, it is restored. And so we're reminded that not only had God's people neglected the Passover, they had neglected the Feast of Unleavened Bread, but they had even neglected worshiping on the Sabbath. And so notice in verse 2, if you would, that Hezekiah continued the reformation. He revived the work of the priests and Levites and assigned them their daily duties in the temple. So not only the Sabbath for worship was revived, but even now they are reviving the sacrifices, which too had been neglected. Well, setting an example of giving, we read about Hezekiah in verse 3 that he brought his portion to be offered, quote, as it is written in the law of the Lord. Now, Hezekiah also commanded the people to give to support those who ministered in the temple, that is, the priests, the Levites, and of course, their families. Well, as we look at verses 5 through 10, we see this wonderful example of stewardship, and for the people's enthusiastic giving is recorded. And so we read in verses 5 through 7 how the people brought tithes and offerings to the temple for 7 months. In fact, it was so much in verse 7, it is described as heaps. And so when Hezekiah and the leaders saw, quote, the heaps, they blessed the Lord and his people Israel. Well, so much was given that the chief priest confessed in verses 9 and 10, we have had enough to eat and have left plenty. What a wonderful testimony that is of stewardship and gratitude on behalf of God's people. Well, verses 11 through 19, so much had been given that storage chambers were established. And so Hezekiah ordered that rooms be prepared to store the offerings of the people in verse 11. And then, as you consider chapter 31 and verses 1 through 15, we notice that verses 14 and 15, really, we notice that there were supervisors and assistants who were chosen to oversee the storage of grain and oils. And then the gifts were distributed to support the Levites' families and priests. Well, as we come to a conclusion for today's devotional, I would invite you to consider Hezekiah's enduring testimony in verses 20 and 21. You see, his zeal for the Lord was known throughout Judah. In fact, we read in verse 20 that he was good, that is generous, and right. He obeyed the law and truth. He was faithful before the Lord his God. What an incredible testimony, and one that you and I should aspire to, that we would be known as being good, right, and truth bearers, generous, obeying the law, and faithful to the Lord. Hezekiah's zeal then was summed up in these words. In every work that he, the king, began in the service of the house of God and in the law and in the commandments to seek the Lord, he did it with all his heart and prospered. Let me ask you, what do you do with all your heart? I think it is an inspiring epitaph of Hezekiah that all that he did with all his heart. Now, everyone wants to be successful, but I wonder how many will sacrifice to please the Lord in everything they do. And so we're challenged by Hezekiah's example to let us not be numbered among the double-minded, the half-hearted, or the lukewarm. Let us live and serve the Lord in such a way that it will be said of us, we lived with one heart, one mind, and one desire to serve the Lord, obey His word, and seek Him with all our hearts. Maybe this devotional has inspired you to do exactly that. What a great model Hezekiah has given us. And I pray that it's been one that you will also follow. Well, God bless you. Thank you for being a part of the Heart of a Shepherd. And I'd invite you to like this and encourage others to follow it as well. God bless you and bye-bye.